Can you hear me okay like that? All right, very good. I want to thank Dr. Carla for my topic, which is cultivating a healing presence, because it gave me the opportunity to contemplate something new that I wouldn't have thought of on my own. That's why Jerome was talking about contemplation. This year for me has seen the culmination of years of preparation, supported by my wonderful monastic community, including the Kansas City people, family, friends. This past November, I was licensed as a mental health counselor in the state of Indiana, and on this past Valentine's Day, I founded a small private practice with the blessing of my bishop, His Grace Bishop Longing of the Serbian Orthodox Church. I didn't choose Valentine's Day for the romantic association, but to honor my mother, a retired psychotherapist whose 88th birthday was on that day. Yes. And to honor Mother Bridget, whose name's day is on the same day, and who also is a graduate in social work. So both have been major inspirations and supports along the way. In January and February, I began to prepare the office where I would have the awesome responsibility of talking with God's children and trying to make a positive difference in their lives. I really threw myself into the planning, the remodeling, and the decorating with all my heart. I was in danger of wearing out my friends describing the latest progress and showing them the latest pictures, which I'm still doing. But at least it's new friends. New people haven't seen it, right? And the story I was telling myself about this, with some chagrin, was that after joining the religious life in my early 20s, I had never had the scope to decorate a place from scratch, and now I was making up for lost time and the nesting instinct. Not particularly monastic, I was aware of that. Don't make me laugh up there. At any rate, as I progressed, I came to see that I was really trying to cultivate a healing atmosphere. Just as my mother before me did this when she was preparing her own private practice space. I was decorating the place as if the place itself could heal people. Imagine my surprise when I learned towards the end of this process that one of the ancient Hebrew names for God is the place, Hamakom. The place gives rise to metaphors for different descriptions of God. For example, He is the address where all creation exists. The Lord makes a place for the world. He provides a place for the world to exist. As a name for God, the place is often translated as the omnipresent, or He who is everywhere present. Very much like the hymn that we'll be singing on Pentecost Sunday a week from now, O Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things. The place is understood as God's comforting presence, and by extension, God's healing presence. One of the ways we can all cultivate a healing presence is through a place. It can be a large place like Antiochian Village, or it can be as small as a little icon shrine in the corner of a room, or even in our car. When we understand God as our ultimate environment, then to honor His presence through how we intentionally appoint space is very appropriate and meaningful. It is a way of expressing reality by stripping away the distractions and clutter. The Jewish tradition also says that God allows us to feel homesick in order to remember that we are the place where He is the place where we ultimately belong. He is our home, and through this longing we can focus on returning to Him. When I'm away from my office, I get homesick for it, even when enjoying the serenity of my monastic self. What are the elements that come together to create a place that reflects God as place? Intention, remembrance of God, expressed through having a place for devotion and holy objects, simplicity, functionality, harmonious color, cleanliness and order. What other things do you think? What things help place express God?
Color.
Color, yeah. What else? Yeah.
Family.
Family. You said it. What else? That's great. Work? Art, yes.
Something living.
Something living, yeah, absolutely. My office is full of plants. I have a chafleur that I call the baby elephant, and plants can see it week to week growing. They say it can get 8 feet tall. So, yeah. Okay, I'd like to share a few lines from a poem about God's presence experienced through place. When I steal into the darkened church, the lingering frankincense makes tangible that sweet presence, swelling the solitude here, where hymns of longing often swell. An important aspect of a healing presence expressed through place goes beyond carefully creating and appointing the space. It is the feeling that is created through the ongoing use of the space. When entering a church, we can tell if it's regularly prayed in or if it has grown cold from disuse. I love going back into the church after divine liturgy has been celebrated. The feeling of the service builds gradually as it is prayed and sung, but afterward, leaving for the agape meal and returning, it is much more palpable by contrast. This feeling of God's grace, the grace of the Holy Spirit, through the exertion and effort of the clergy and congregation. Liturgy means work of the people. Cultivating a healing presence, then, is not only about creating special places, but about how we use them. How we are intentional in remembering that God is always here, the address where the sacred space exists. He is humble. He does not force us to remember or acknowledge him. It's up to us to wish to cultivate his presence. The more we use a chosen place to pray, to do sacred reading, cleansing the atmosphere with holy water, and doing other pious activities, the more we cultivate its healing presence. What other activities can we do that cultivate a space? Prayer, reading, what else? Music. Hmm? Music, okay, that's a real important thing. Yeah. And if we choose to play music there, the choice of music is also very important. Some music fosters a healing presence and some completely disrupts it. I'd like to share a life experience that illustrates the power of music. Many decades ago, I was on a renovation crew for a restaurant. It was in the early years of my spiritual journey, and the rest of the crew members were also part of that journey, but they were tough guys and liked to play various kinds of popular music. I remember to my surprise finding that when the hard rock came on, I became clumsy and had accidents, but when the music was more gentle, then I was okay. So I won't say what kind of music is good, but it's important to be attentive and notice the effects. Healing presence through material substance. St. Nikolai Velimirovich brings to light the topic of healing presence in a lesson from some collected writings. It's called The Mystery of Touch. And he introduces his topic with the idea that touch operates by more than just the sense of touch, that is surface and skin, but also by smell and look, and even by the mere presence of things and persons. So I like that idea of bringing presence into the whole idea of sacred touch. So then a healing presence is held not only in a space, but also in material substances. For example, holy water and oil, as we mentioned earlier. When we create our sacred space, we have to include these. Presence is specially manifested in the holy icons. The icon brings together the skill and piety of the artist and the grace of the saint who's painted in the icon, and the fervor of the people who pray in front of it. And I have a couple of interesting stories about people in recent times who have consciously set about to create a miracle-working icon. Yeah, because most of the miracle-working icons that we're aware of, it was discovered they were miraculous, maybe centuries after they were initially painted. The first instance pertains to the Romanian skeet of the forerunner of Mount Athos. In 1863, the founder really wanted that particular monastery, the Romanian one on Mount Athos, to have a miracle-working icon because all the other monasteries had one. And so they had to have one too, so they were going to have one painted. So they looked around to find a painter who would follow all the regulations. And it's kind of scary, Father Jerome, after reading this, I didn't want to call myself an icon painter anymore. But at any rate, the painter had to agree not only to avoid any kind of vice, like getting angry and yelling at people and so on, but to fast, abstain from food and water until the day's work was done, and to do the Akathis to the Mother of God every single day while working on it. So he finished the background and the robes and the face of the Virgin and Child, and he wasn't happy with the face. Everything else was gorgeous, but the faces just were out of proportion, disharmonious, displeasing. He was an older painter. He was just afraid he had forgotten his art, and he just kind of, in a state of despondency, covered the icon with a cloth, locked the studio for the night, and went to bed. And the next morning he got up and made prostrations and prayed fervently that God would enlighten him how to paint it. And when he unveiled the icon, it had been miraculously finished to perfection. And they call this Theotokos, not made by human hands. And she works many miracles. And the second instance in Vadapeti Monastery at Mount Athos, they also have a miracle-working icon called the Queen of All, who is known especially for helping in cases of cancer. And we have an akathist to the healer of cancer that we can say. And in Russia, there was a group that worked with an oncology ward for children in Moscow, and they wanted a miracle-working copy of this icon. So they got the blessing from the patriarch and abbots and all the appropriate people, and then they chose their painter, a Russian by the name of Vladimir, did a holy liturgy, did prayers for blessing of holy water, and then they had him mix all his paints with the holy water to paint a miraculous icon. And God honored the intention, and the copy, or I think there may be 2 copies in Russia, are able to really help people who have cancer. So there is healing presence through icons. And finally, it's not just how the icon is created, but also the piety of the people who pray in front of it is also part of the mystery, because there are a number of myrrh-streaming icons, special icons that travel from place to place, and depending on the fervor and piety of the particular place where people are praying, the amount of myrrh depends on the fervor with which people are praying. So some places the icon would go and it would be virtually dry, in other places it would just stream like a fountain. And so there's a real synergy of the artist, God's grace, and the people who are praying. And here's an interesting story that highlights the synergy between the icon on the one hand and the healing place on the other. The abbot of Hilandar Monastery of Mount Athos came to visit Indianapolis, and he told this story. We did the akathis, for those of you who got up early this morning, we did the akathis to the 3-handed icon of the Mother of God, and this is about that same icon, which is at Hilandar. Whenever you pray to the Mother of God before her 3-handed icon, you are directly connected with Hilandar, where she is the abbess. I want to share a recent miracle. A man came to Hilandar for the first time. looking intently at the layout and ordering of all the buildings. He related that his sister in Thessaloniki had been bedridden, awaiting surgery. She had been praying before her print of the three-handed icon, and later, in a vision during sleep, the woman came to her saying that she would be well and would not need surgery. The invalid asked, "Who are you?" And the woman replied, "I am the mother of Jesus Christ, come from the three-handed icon of Hilandar." In this vision, the Theotokos showed her the appearance of the monastery. The bedridden woman had never seen any photograph or image of it before. When she woke up, the former invalid was able to get up completely well. She called her brother and said, "Have you been to Hilandar praying for me?" And he said, "Well, no." And she was then examined by the physicians, who confirmed that she was well and pronounced that this was by a miracle of God. These are probably Greek physicians. It would be harder to hear that here. But not if it were Dr. Carla. The woman asked her brother to go to Hilandar and offer thanks on her behalf. He went and found it looking exactly as she had described it, although she had never seen it. A healing presence not only comes through icons, but through ordinary objects as well, that have touched the body of a living temple of God. We remember the story from the Bible. In the apostolic times, God continued to do extraordinary miracles by Paul's hands. When the handkerchiefs and aprons that touched his skin were taken to the sick, their diseases left them, and the evil spirits went out of them. This miracle was repeated in the 20th century in the death of St. Nectarius of Egina. During the last days of his life, St. Nectarius was in a room for incurables of the hospital. Among many poor patients who were at the point of death, beside the bed of the saint was a patient who had been paralyzed for many years. As soon as St. Nectarius gave up his spirit, a nurse of the hospital, together with a nun who had accompanied him, began to prepare the holy body for transportation to Egina for burial. They removed an old sweater from the body and placed it on the bed of the paralytic, who immediately became well and rose from his bed, praising the Lord. This was the first miracle after the repose of St. Nectarius, so even ordinary objects can acquire a healing presence when they come in touch, like they're magnetized. Well, maybe we won't be able to do things like that. Maybe things that touch our bodies won't convey healing, but maybe we'll be entrusted with things like that. For instance, it could be holy water or a bit of cotton soaked in myrrh from a myrrh-streaming icon, or an icon blessed to the Holy Sepulchre. When we are given guardianship of such special things, we must cultivate their healing presence by holding what is God's in honor. We need to store such materials in suitable containers and ensure that the holy water or oil is never discarded in a profane way. We need to ensure that others will not accidentally pour them out or throw them away. And of course, we need to use them with faith. A reverential attitude is important to cultivate. Looking back to the Bible, the whole story of sin and salvation is bound up with our position with respect to God's presence. In Genesis, the first people hid from God's face, his presence, when they realized they had sinned. And in both the original Greek and Hebrew, the word face is used to mean presence. They heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord amongst the trees of the garden. Our Savior Jesus Christ took flesh so that human beings could again see the face of God through his Son and stand in his presence. By this he healed the shame and abandonment that Adam and Eve experienced after that first sin. From Pascha until Ascension, we repeatedly hear the Paschal verses from Psalm 67. In these verses, the punishment of God's enemies and the blessings of the righteous are both expressed in terms of God's face, his presence. Let God arise and let his enemies be scattered. Let those who hate him flee from before his face. As smoke vanishes, so let them vanish. As wax melts in the face of fire, so let sinners perish before the face of God. But let the righteous be glad. Let them leap for joy before the face of God. When we think of healing presence, more than place or objects, of course, we think of people who embody that. I want to share a recent example of healing, not of the body, but healing of community, just as we've been talking about healing of community on Troost Avenue. This was healing a split in the Serbian church that came about as a result of wounds from communism, so that there was an official church that was recognized by the communists and a free church that was not related to the communists. So during this time of the split, there was in the free church a certain man by the name of Metropolitan Irenae. And it's kind of ironic because Irenae means peaceful. But he had a very strong personality. That's something that Serbs and African Americans often have in common, is strong personality. He was known to rule by an iron hand. And he wasn't that well liked by the other bishops. But he was sent as part of a delegation from the Free Church to meet with Patriarch Pavla to talk about reunification. During that meeting, Metropolitan Irenae was seated close to the Patriarch. One of the bishops who disliked him made repeated personal attacks, and the iron-handed bishop said not a word in his defense or the defense of his cause. After the meeting, one of his party lit into him. "Why didn't you stand up for us? You just sat there like a baby." The Metropolitan replied, "Here's how it was. I'm listening to that bishop, I'm boiling mad and about to explode, and then I glance at the Patriarch and all the steam just goes out of me. And I tried 3 or 4 times and the same thing happened. And here's how the incident was resolved." After the meeting had gone on for some time, the Patriarch said, "Let's say a prayer." Another said, "But the meeting isn't over." He said, "Yes, it is. Better people than we need to make these decisions." And at the subsequent meeting with the Patriarch, the split was healed. And now there's a reunified Serbian church through the prayers of Patriarch Pavla. On a personal note, I had my own experience of healing presence many years ago at one of the very first African Christianity conferences in Kansas City. The schedule was packed so full that in order to make a personal connection with anybody, to have conversations, we had to wait until the wee hours of the morning. And so it was, there was an Ethiopian priest there with whom I hoped to converse, to learn whatever he wished to share about his life in his home culture. I was also in touch with a really empty feeling inside, an emptiness that seemed to have been there for a long time. But I said nothing to him about my inner pain. But as I listened to him paint a picture of the Orthodox life as it was in his culture, I was also aware that that empty place was gradually filling up. It was as if somebody were pouring from a pitcher until it was completely full. When I did not think I could hold any more, I breathed the silent prayer, "Lord, this is enough." And right at that point, the priest got up and said, "Okay, it's time to retire." And that was well over a decade ago, and the feeling of emptiness has never returned since. And so that is healing presence in action, not just through an individual, but through a whole culture that is dedicated to Christ. So how do we incorporate more of this into our lives? We've looked now at a variety of examples of people who carry a healing presence and how it manifests in the lives of others. The big question is, what can we as ordinary people do to carry more of a healing presence? First of all, I'd like to share a little analogy from the medical field. We know that there are rare, highly trained specialists like neurosurgeons, who are very few in number. There are family practice physicians and nurse practitioners with a more generalized training who are more numerous. And finally, there are ordinary people who've learned how to wrap a sprained ankle, pull a splinter, or to use the folk remedies that Manishka Mikaela was talking about. When we need the help, we really appreciate these people who can do some first aid, and we really can't live without that. Whereas on the other hand, most of us will never need a neurosurgeon.